Welcome back to my channel. With the release of Blumhouse's The Craft Legacy, today we're going to first talk about its predecessor, The Craft. Before we begin, let me know in the comments your thoughts on The Craft, and make sure to give this a thumbs up if you like these reviews. It helps me out immensely if you do that. Also, if you're new here and you like movies, whether it be blockbusters, hidden gems, or everything in between, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases and some classics. But now, let's jump right into it. This film stars Robin Tunney as Sarah, a transfer student in a new high school with unusual abilities who forms a friendship with three outcast girls, played by Fairuza Balk, Neve Campbell, and Rachel True, and all three of them are rumored to be witches. And as Sarah gets closer to them, they form a coven of witches, and the four begin conjuring spells against those that wrong them. One thing I wanted to say before getting into this, I will be discussing some spoilers. My reviews are normally spoiler-free, but with my reviews of older films, I'll tend to break that rule from time to time. I want to discuss some things that happen later on in the film, so if you haven't seen it by now, this is your spoiler warning. But anyway, here we go. This was released in 1996 and is written and directed by Andrew Fleming, who went on to direct comedies such as Hamlet 2 and the remake of The In-Laws. This received mixed reviews at the time, but it was a hit with audiences, and in the following years it attained a cult following, which is actually sort of news to me, as I gotta admit, I never even heard of this movie until a month ago when the trailer for The Craft Legacy dropped. A lot of people were talking about it, and it was then that I discovered the existence of this film and the following that it had. I have no idea how this film slipped totally under my radar, but here we are. So, this review is based on my very first time watching it just the other day in preparation for the new film. It was released the same year as Scream, and even though it was released only a few months before Scream, it goes well with many of the other teen horror movies that were inspired by Scream, such as I Know What You Did Last Summer, Final Destination, and many others. It even has some of the same stars, those being Neve Campbell and Skeet Ulrich, who plays a guy that Robin Tunney goes on a date with. Most of the actors involved here feel like a blast from the past, with others such as Breckin Meyer and Christine Taylor even showing up in supporting roles. This feels very much like a product of the 90s, with a soundtrack blasting alternative rock tracks in nearly every other scene. Even if you weren't aware going in what year this was made, you'll more than likely be able to realize it on your own very quickly. It's incredibly dated, and for me, having seen so many of these other types of films already, there's kind of a cliched feel to it, even though it actually predates all the other movies I've seen before it. And it can be pretty cheesy at times. Some of the acting, mainly by the supporting cast, isn't all that great. There are scenes, for example, where Sarah's talking to her dad, played by Cliff DeYoung, and it's incredibly flat. There's also a guy with snakes early on who Sarah keeps running into, and he's supposed to come off as creepy, but his delivery is so casual that it's almost laughably bad. Despite all that, it's a fun movie. I think if I had seen it much earlier than I did and had more of an attachment to it, maybe I'd appreciate it a little more, but I still had a good time with it, and that appears to be what this movie was setting out to accomplish. It's these four girls who have powers and use them against those that wrong them, or to right some wrongs that were out of their control. Robin Tunney uses her powers to cast a love spell on Skeet Ulrich, who started to spread false rumors about her that they had sex after their date. Neve Campbell has burn scars from an accident that she heals. Meanwhile, Fairuza Balk's powers protect her from an abusive stepfather, while Rachel True uses her powers to stand up to Christine Taylor, who plays a racist bully who continually goes after her. And what I appreciate about this film is that it gives us reasons to care about each of these characters. Just because they're witches, they're not automatically portrayed as bad people. What's really worth noting is, even though Scream is known as the movie that bucked a lot of horror stereotypes and reinvented the genre a bit, this film also ended up being a subversion of the genre itself. Before this, in Scream, the role of women in most horror movies was usually running around, screaming, and outside of the final girl trope, they were never in this position of power, and even then, it wouldn't be until the last few minutes. The Craft was, at the time, a rare horror movie where it had the roles reversed, and it was actually four lead characters who were all women, who were in positions of power, and had the upper hand on everyone else, especially against the men that wronged them. And they were all characters we cared about. While Scream gets a lot of credit for its reinvention of the horror genre, especially the final girl trope, The Craft also deserves a lot of credit for its own subversion of the genre. It was ahead of its time, even if only by a few months. And this actually takes a horror approach to touch upon some other things that a lot of people can relate to at one point or another. High school is never the easiest for many people. Kids are divided into cliques, and there are those who will be shunned very unfairly. And while some of the other students here can come off as cartoonish at times, the film still captures that atmosphere well, as it highlights the relationships between the main characters and everyone else. So there's a sense of satisfaction when these girls stand up to everyone else who made their lives hell on a daily basis. So I'm sure there were those who saw this when they were in high school and had an absolute blast with this, as they were all able to relate to the outcast for once having the upper hand. And even though it's not exactly a comedy, there's still a very fun tone established, with the characters making snarky remarks most of the time, and the effects tending to be very over the top, especially given how special effects were at the time. Like I said, while it's extremely dated, you're meant to have a good time with it. And the performances from all four main actors solidify that. They all seem like they were having a ball while filming this. When there are moments that require them to go a little big with the material, especially in the second half, they go big. And while at times it can be too silly, there are other times, mainly towards towards the beginning where we're supposed to take them seriously, as we're meant to have sympathy for them when we see them constantly get made fun of. And thanks to the performances, I found that all to be successful. As far as other issues though, I think this had some problems in terms of pacing, mainly in its second act, and as it transitions to the third act. I felt around the 50-minute to an hour mark, it seemed a little aimless. After the other girls get their powers and they get revenge on those who wronged them, and before it got into the final act, there didn't seem to be much conflict. And for a moment, it turned into nothing but a typical cheesy 90s teen drama, as it's just the four witches all hanging out. And it didn't really work for me. I think there were at least 10 minutes of this that could have easily been cut. As for the final act itself, I didn't dislike it, but the way it got there, it just seemed to be very sudden. What happens is Fairuza Balk's character Nancy gets power hungry and she begins to clearly lack empathy and have a total disregard for everyone around her. It all gets to her head and it ends with her killing Skeet Ulrich's character in rage. So Sarah, who had her own problems with Skeet Ulrich's character, was clearly traumatized by that, and while by herself, tries performing a spell on Nancy in order to stop her from continuing to harm others. But in the very next scene, all three of the other witches turn on Sarah and begin to make her life a living hell. And it just seemed very sudden, because while Nancy was one thing, there were never any hints of conflict between Sarah and the other two. There was never any sense of animosity between them. And it just goes from 0 to 100 really fast like that. The fact that Neve Campbell and Rachel True also turn on her so quickly, and we never actually see that moment that caused them to do that, it just feels like it comes out of nowhere. And from a character development perspective, it's very jarring. But as for the final act in general, like I said, I thought it was enjoyable. It goes in super heavy on the special effects and practical effects as it gets into this fight between Nancy and Sarah. And it's very theatrical and over the top, and we see things like bugs on the wall and worms all over the place, and it's all great. While it was a bit of a bumpy ride getting to that point, I thought it was a fun, action-packed finale and ended things on a satisfying note. This was an enjoyable movie. It's far from perfect as it's incredibly dated, has some pacing issues, and can be very cheesy at times, but it's still a good time. I liked its subversive take on the horror genre, as well as the performances from the four lead characters. And while the cheesiness can be to its detriment, it's also silly, sarcastic, and very over the top, and in the end just wants you to have some fun. I'm glad I finally got to checking it out, and if you haven't by now, definitely give it a shot. The Craft gets a 7.5 out of 10. So let me know, have you seen The Craft or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you find it scary? Did you like the story? And what's your favorite 90s horror movie? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, I'll catch you next time.